The patrol never returned. 14 minutes past scheduled contact. 3 heartbeats between each chronometer check. 7 seconds of silence on the comm channel. In the Dominion, schedules were sacred mathematics. Delays meant death. Sub-Commander Vex'hai's thermal scope painted the human settlement in deceptive tranquility. Heat signatures moving in orderly patterns between reconstructed buildings, their movements predictable as orbital mechanics. After 47 cycles of occupation, Terra-Seven had achieved perfect compliance, yet his sensory apparatus registered wrongness in frequencies he couldn't name. "Sir!" Corporal Nithyan's voice crackled through the comm, sharp like glass breaking. "Thermal bloom detected. Grid 77 Alpha. Large energy discharge." Vex'hai's 3 hearts skipped in sequence, left, center, right. Grid 77 Alpha was Sergeant Colrex's patrol sector, the same sector that had gone silent. The thermal bloom painted his visor in urgent crimson, bleeding across the spectrum like a wound in reality. My designation is Sub-Commander Vex'hai, 9th Resonance of the Dominion Pacification Corps, and I document the impossible for those who will refuse to believe it. On Kethmora, my homeworld where crystal spires sing in the solar wind, warfare concluded with the ceremony of crystalline acknowledgement. The defeated arranged themselves in mathematical perfection while their leaders recited harmony songs. Order emerged from chaos. Civilization conquered barbarism. I learned this from Harmonizer Thex, my mentor who died teaching me that victory was inevitable for those who understood the frequencies. Terra-Seven should have been identical. My thermal spectrum analysis had painted the settlement in gradients of surrender cool blues of compliance, orderly heat signatures of rationing cues, the predictable patterns of a broken species accepting new management. Every metric confirmed successful pacification. 847,000 resistance casualties eliminated, 97.3% civilian compliance achieved, infrastructure damage within acceptable reconstruction parameters. Yet something resonated wrong. The humans queued for nutritional supplements without the electromagnetic field fluctuations that typically indicated resentment in conquered populations. Instead, they produced coordinated acoustic vibrations, tonal patterns my linguistic processors dismissed as meaningless vocalizations, like hearing music through water, harmonics my translator couldn't parse. But patterns imply purpose. Pacification proceeds according to doctrinal expectations. I transmitted to my crystalline recording matrix, though my sensory equipment flickered with its first malfunction of the cycle, a minor calibration drift. Nothing significant. Human psychological profile matches preliminary assessments for species classification 7. Technically primitive, socially hierarchical, responds predictably to superior force demonstration. During thermal cycle rotations, I observed families salvaging materials from destruction zones. Their heat patterns showed focused engagement rather than scattered confusion. A juvenile specimen, perhaps 10 solar rotations in biological development, extracted twisted metal fragments while producing those inexplicable acoustic patterns. Humming. The human word was humming. Specimen. I addressed it in their crude verbal system. My vocal cords, struggling with their linear sound structures, explain the functional purpose of your vocalizations. The adult humans exhibited standard freeze responses, but the juvenile continued its acoustic production and oriented toward me with optical organs that reflected our illumination systems like captured stars. In perfectly modulated hegemonic high-frequency impossible, my sensors must be malfunctioning. It responded, "We remember better when we sing." My electromagnetic field fluctuated into shock patterns. No human possessed linguistic access to our communication systems. Remember what specifically? I managed. It arranged its facial muscles into what my behavioral database classified as a pleasure expression. Though contextual analysis suggested this classification was incomplete, dangerously incomplete, and resumed material extraction without further response. Its small hands moved with precision, selecting specific metal fragments and arranging them in a pattern I couldn't decipher. The circle it created in the ash was perfectly geometric, suggesting premeditation. 17 separate sensor anomalies during that observation period. 17. I should have initiated Priority 7 intelligence protocols. Instead, I stood watching this impossible specimen produce incomprehensible acoustic patterns while systematically dismantling ruins with the patience of a harmonic sculptor on Kethmora patient, intentional, each action contributing to patterns I couldn't perceive yet knew were there. Like equations written in frequencies my species couldn't detect. What else had they learned? The explosion hit them like mathematics made manifest, precise, inevitable, complete. Sergeant Colrex and his unit had achieved non-existence on Cycle 47. I led the recovery operation through carbonized fields, my sensory apparatus struggling now, filters clogged with particulates that tasted of failure. 3 kilometers from their last position, we discovered their remains. They'd been terminated using Dominion pulse rifles. Our own weapons, discharged with precision that indicated intimate familiarity with our physiological vulnerabilities. Each shot placed exactly where our natural armor demonstrated minimal effectiveness knowledge that required detailed anatomical study. One of the dead was Corporal HFY, whom I'd personally trained. His third eye had been targeted first, tactically optimal, emotionally devastating. Impossible, Nithyan transmitted, his voice crackling with disbelief. And something else, fear harmonics, I'd never detected in him before. The humans lack technical comprehension. His statement terminated, as we discovered what the humans had accomplished afterward. Someone had carved symbols into the pulse rifle stocks, not crude scratches, but precise geometric patterns matching mathematical principles our weapons engineers utilized for calibration optimization. The modifications weren't just functional, they were improvements. The safety mechanisms had been refined, made more efficient for human physiology. The firing sequences optimized. Whoever performed this understood not merely how to operate our technology, but how to perfect it. 6 cycles later, the fuel depot converted itself into a miniature star. Vex'hai's audio dampeners screamed as superheated air hit like a physical blow. Through the observation dome, he watched a perfect column of flame rise into twilight too perfect, too controlled for accident. The combustion followed the precise thermal dynamics his academy instructors had described in theoretical scenarios. Textbook execution. Evacuation teams to industrial sector, he barked. But his words drowned in emergency klaxons that shrieked in frequencies designed to cause maximum auditory distress to his species. The humans had modified those, too. Racing through corridors that suddenly felt like a maze, his enhanced optics caught movement in peripheral vision. A shadow that shouldn't exist, moving through smoke with purpose. Human boots on metal sounded wrong, too light, too fast, too coordinated, like they knew exactly where to step. He spun, pulse rifle tracking, but found only empty air and the acrid smell of thermite. His targeting sensors flickered. Another malfunction. 17 this cycle. Always 17. At the blast site, the forensics team stood in stunned silence. The twisted storage tank bore words burned 3 meters high in perfect hegemonic script. We are still here. But understanding was achieved in stages. The message wasn't created during the explosion. Someone had burned preliminary marks using thermal paste, calculating exactly how the thermite charges would flow, what temperature would be required, how the blast would frame their words in incandescent perfection. Sir? Nithyan's voice barely maintained cohesion. The thermal scarring. Someone burned this message before detonation. They calculated exactly. I know, Vex'hai interrupted, his 3 hearts synchronizing in a rhythm that suggested systemic stress. The humans hadn't just destroyed their fuel depot, they'd turned it into educational material. That thermal cycle, during routine equipment inspection, the armorer reported microscopic modifications to 17% of small arms inventory. 17. Alterations invisible to standard diagnostics, but catastrophic under sustained combat conditions. The modifications required intimate knowledge of Dominion weapons design, metallurgy, stress engineering, knowledge that allegedly didn't exist in human databases. During investigation of a destroyed communication relay, Vex'hai discovered his graduation crystal secured in his private quarters, given to him by Harmonizer Thex before his mentor's death, arranged in the center of a mandala constructed from twisted equipment fragments. The geometric precision was flawless, mathematical, intentional. They'd been inside, studying not just technology but personal effects, individual histories, psychological profiles. They have been observing us, Nithyan stated, his electromagnetic field fluctuating with stress patterns that registered off-scale. Since initial arrival. That night, Vex'hai sealed his quarters and listened to the compound establishing defensive positions. But underneath familiar harmonic frequencies, he detected something else, acoustic patterns at the periphery of his auditory range, emanating from the settlements. Singing, always singing. The melody echoed in harmonics his translator still couldn't pass, but this time he recognized the mathematical relationships underlying the tonal structures. They were counting, calculating, memorizing the exact timing of patrol routes, the precise frequency of shift changes, the specific intervals between security sweeps. What had they taken while inside? When the fortress became a tomb, it happened at local midnight. The compound's power grid didn't fail gradually, it ceased to exist in synchronized perfection across 17 separate systems. Emergency illumination activated exactly 2.7 seconds later, bathing everything in crimson wavelengths. The humans had timed their breach for that specific delay. Through the 2.7 seconds of absolute darkness, Vex'hai heard sounds that would etch themselves into his memory in frequencies that hurt, boots hitting deck plates in coordinated rhythm, the soft whisper of thermal lances beginning their cutting sequence, the distinctive click of human weapons with Dominion modifications chambering rounds optimized for his species' vulnerabilities. When the lights returned, his world had already ended. "Sir," Nithyan's voice crackled through failing comms. "Humans have breached outer perimeter. They're using atmospheric weapons life support can't compensate." Through reinforced observation apertures, Vex'hai witnessed his education reaching its conclusion. Figures moved through smoke that flowed wrong, following ventilation patterns that should have dispersed it. The fortress architecture was working against them, doors sealed backward, trapping defenders in kill zones, emergency lighting guided attackers rather than defenders. The temperature climbed asymptotically toward lethal thresholds. Every system they'd trusted was executing protocols they hadn't written. "Evacuation," Vex'hai began, but chemical fog infiltrated his breathing apparatus. Someone had modified the atmospheric filters to concentrate rather than disperse toxins. His nasal filters burned. 17 minutes of emergency oxygen remained. Exactly 17. The probability of survival decreased asymptotically toward zero. Through expanding chaos, he detected explosions from communication arrays, vehicle storage, medical facilities. Each blast timed for maximum psychological impact. He watched a squad of his soldiers round a corner, instinctively turning left under stress, directly into a human firing position that had anticipated that exact movement. The fortress had become their enemy. Main blast barriers began glowing cherry red along precisely drawn lines. Not random cutting geometric patterns that suggested someone had studied the door's structural integrity, calculated optimal failure points, engineered the perfect breach. They were coming through. Vex'hai crawled toward the data archives, his 3 hearts hammering discordantly. If he could save the tactical intelligence, the anatomical studies, the technological specifications, he found Vex'hai, a young soldier he'd trained personally, trapped under debris near the archive entrance. Her breathing apparatus was cracked, oxygen hissing away. The archives glowed untouched beyond her. The choice was instantaneous. He grabbed Vex'hai, dragging her towards secondary evacuation routes, abandoning the data. 30 seconds later, the archives exploded. They'd known he would choose his soldier over information. They'd studied not just his tactics, but his values. They'd planted charges on a timer that accounted for his compassion, his training, his predictable command decisions. They understood him better than he understood himself. Ash fell like snow, thick particulates coating everything in grey uniformity. He pulled Vex'hai through corridors, transformed into crematoriums, walls radiating heat from fires burning just beyond perception. The smoke moved with purpose, herding them, channeling them, toward the central corridor, toward her. The child sat cross-legged in a perfect circle of ash, drawing equations with one small finger, while the fortress died around her. Her movements scattered ash in precise patterns, but she paused when larger pieces fell, waiting for them to settle before continuing. Patient, methodical, she hummed while she worked that same acoustic pattern he'd dismissed as meaningless 47 cycles ago. Memory training. They'd been memorizing operational plans through song. You? Vex'hai gasped through failing life support, leaving Shexkai slumped against the wall. You orchestrated this. She looked up with eyes that reflected flames like captured stars. When she spoke, her voice harmonized in frequencies that shouldn't be possible from human vocal cords. Every security sweep taught us your patrol routes. Every equipment inspection showed us your technology. Every conversation you thought we couldn't understand became our curriculum. The schematic she'd drawn in ash resolved into terrible clarity his compound's vulnerabilities, annotated with failure points and chemical compositions that would take Dominion engineers cycles to discover. But she'd labeled each section with numbers. 17 access points, 17 modified weapons, 17 minutes of oxygen, 17. You were never broken. He transmitted, though he knew the answer. No, she agreed, adding her final calculation to the proof. We were learning how to break you. Behind her, figures emerged through the breach with surgical precision. Humans carrying modified Dominion weapons, their movements coordinated like mathematical proofs made flesh. Each step inevitable, each action building toward inescapable conclusions. They advanced in a pattern that exploited every tactical doctrine he'd ever studied, every response protocol he'd ever taught. One of them moved past him without firing, heading toward Shexkai. The human knelt, examined her breathing apparatus with practiced efficiency, and sealed the crack with human polymer adhesive. Then moved on. They weren't here to kill everyone, just to teach the lesson. The child stood, brushing ash from her clothes with movements that scattered her equations into chaos. But Vex'hai had seen enough to understand their meaning. She'd drawn this circle before the battle started, calculated the optimal position where she could observe the entire engagement, predicted exactly where he would crawl to seek escape. The blast barriers surrendered with a sound like reality fracturing. Vex'hai stumbled toward what remained of evacuation routes, pulling Shexkai with him, his sensory apparatus failing completely now. No thermal vision, no electromagnetic field detection, no auditory enhancement. Just his natural senses, degraded to baseline function, experiencing reality the way the humans did, blind, deaf, helpless. The final transmission he managed. Terra-Seven pacification complete failure. Human resistance capabilities catastrophically underestimated. They are not an eliminated species, they weaponize their own destruction for educational purposes. They are still here. They were always here. Recommend immediate. The comm died. 17 system failures achieving synchronization. As he collapsed into the evacuation shuttle with 3 other survivors from a garrison of 300, Vex'hai looked down through the viewport at the burning settlement. Chemical fires painted everything in shades of orange and red, transforming the human world into something his species could never inhabit. They would rather exist in ashes than kneel in palaces. But between the flames, new structures were already rising. The humans were building again, constructing from ashes of everything they'd sacrificed, everything they'd learned. And in the orbital traffic control frequencies, almost too faint to register, he detected that familiar acoustic pattern, the mathematical melody that had haunted his occupation from the beginning. Now he understood its functional purpose. A song of calculation, a song of observation, a song of education that would never, ever conclude. Through the viewport, as the shuttle climbed toward orbital safety, he saw her, the child, standing in the ruins of his fortress, looking up at his departing ship. She raised one small hand, not in mockery, not in triumph, but like a student waving goodbye to a teacher. The gesture was perfectly timed, perfectly positioned for him to see through the viewport, at this exact altitude, this exact angle. She'd calculated that too. The humans hadn't been conquered, they'd been attending class, and we had been the curriculum. End of educational session. Final status report. Survivors: 4 from garrison of 300 tactical intelligence, recovered, 0 human casualties inflicted during evacuation, 0 human lessons learned. Incalculable. Probability of Dominion victory in subsequent engagements, asymptotically approaching zero. This concludes Sub-Commander Vex'hai's testimony before the Strategic Command Council. Recommended action: complete evacuation of Terra-Seven. Recommended classification: species classification upgrade from 7 to 1 existential threat. Recommendation status: rejected. Council consensus: isolated incident. Maintain occupation. Council reassessment scheduled. Never required. Terra-Seven human forces initiated complete liberation of occupied territories 17 cycles later. Dominion forces withdrew without engaging. They had learned their lesson.